My wife has the degrees. All you have is an apron fit to be our unpaid maid, my son said at Thanksgiving dinner. But what he and his wife whispered behind closed doors was worse. They planned to dump me in a cheap nursing home. What they never checked was whose name was on the deed. Days later, they were panicking, calling my name as their entire world began falling apart. If you found this channel today, I am so glad you did. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from city, state, country? Let's see how far this reaches. Also worth knowing, certain names and details in this story have been created or adjusted for narrative and educational purposes. Similarities to actual people or places are coincidental. The message, however, is entirely intentional. The first thing I did that morning, the way I did every Thanksgiving for the past 11 years, was reach for the light switch in the dark. It was 4:30 in the morning. The rest of Naperville was asleep. The neighbors across the street hadn't even turned their porch light on yet, and the sky outside the kitchen window was the kind of black that makes you feel like the whole world has been put away somewhere and forgotten. I stood in that kitchen in my robe and slippers, and I flicked on the overhead light, and I looked at the counter I'd already laid out the night before. 2 roasting pans, a mixing bowl, a stick of butter softening on a plate, a handwritten list in my own handwriting, 7 items long that I'd written at the kitchen table the night before, while Brandon and Jessica watched something loud in the living room and didn't ask what I was planning. They never asked what I was planning. I tied on my apron, the old one, the one with the faded blue stripes that Frank had given me the Christmas before he got sick. He spent 4 years bedridden before he passed, which meant I had been carrying Thanksgiving alone for 11 years by the time that morning came and I started on the turkey. I had brined it overnight in a pot so big it barely fit in the refrigerator, and getting it out required both arms and a kind of controlled stumble to the counter that I'd gotten good at over the years. 22 pounds. I'd ordered it from the butcher on 5th Street because the grocery store birds always came out dry, and Brandon had just once mentioned that the Thanksgiving turkey was dry, and I had never once let that happen again. That was 8 years ago. He hadn't said thank you once in all the years since. I told myself it didn't matter. That was the deal I'd made with myself sometime around year 3 of doing this alone, that I cooked because I loved to cook, because Frank had loved my cooking, because the smell of a roasting bird in a warm house on a cold November morning was one of the few things left in the world that still felt entirely mine. I told myself that every year. By 4:30 on a Thanksgiving morning, I was usually good at believing it. I got the turkey into the oven at 5:15. By 6, I had the pie crusts rolled and fitted into their pans. 1 pumpkin, 1 pecan. Because Linda Marsh didn't eat pumpkin, and I always remembered things like that, even when nobody thought to tell me. By 7, I had the stuffing assembled and covered on the counter, the green beans blanched, and waiting the good china pulled down from the cabinet above the refrigerator and stacked on the dining room table, because Jessica had once broken 2 pieces of my mother's everyday set, and I no longer left it within easy reach. I showered and dressed with flour still on my hands and was back in the kitchen by 7:45. Brandon came downstairs at 9:30. He was wearing a pressed button-down shirt, dark trousers, and the cologne I'd given him for his birthday. He looked handsome and rested and entirely unbothered by the smell of 4 hours of cooking that had filled every room in the house. "Morning, Mom," he said, opening the refrigerator and taking out the orange juice. "Morning," I said. "Turkey's been in since 5. Should be ready by noon." "Great." He poured himself a glass, didn't offer to pour one for me, and leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. "Jessica's almost ready. She wants to know if we need more ice." "I bought ice yesterday," I said. "It's in the freezer in the garage." "Cool." He took his orange juice and his phone and went back into the living room. I turned back to the stove and stirred the gravy base I had going in the small saucepan, and I told myself the same thing I told myself every year, that this was love. That doing the work was the same as being loved. That a family that shows up is a family that loves you, even if showing up looks different for different people. And some people show up pressed and cologne-scented, while other people show up at 4:30 in the dark with flour on their hands. I was very good at telling myself things, By 9:45, Jessica came downstairs in a red dress that I privately thought was too formal for a family Thanksgiving, and heels that clicked on the hardwood floor I had mopped the evening before. She looked beautiful. She smelled like perfume I couldn't name. "Oh, Maggie," she said, stopping in the kitchen doorway and pressing her hand to her chest the way she always did, the gesture that was supposed to mean she was moved. "It smells incredible in here. You are such a saint." "Just cooking," I said. "We're so lucky to have you." She said it the way you say the weather is nice, pleasantly, without really seeing it. Then her heels clicked across my clean floor to the refrigerator, where she took out a bottle of white wine to let it come to temperature, and then clicked back out of the kitchen without asking if I needed anything. I watched the door swing shut behind her. Outside, the first car was already pulling into the driveway. I heard the sound of doors' voices, someone's child shouting something, and then Brandon's voice rising to greet them, warm and easy, the voice of a man welcoming guests into his home. I untucked a dish towel from the oven, handle wiped my hands, and reached for my apron strings to straighten them. The party was starting. In the kitchen, I was already invisible, and somehow I had let it happen so gradually I'd never noticed the moment it began. Ruth Dawson was the first one through the door, the way she always was. She was Frank's cousin on his mother's side, which made her something between family and neighbor in the way that only Midwesterners fully understand, close enough to have a standing invitation too fond of me to pretend things were fine when they weren't. She was carrying a store-bought pie she'd clearly picked up that morning because the sticker from Jewel Osco was still on the bottom. She hugged Brandon like he'd built the house with his own hands, told Jessica her dress was stunning, and then leaned into the kitchen doorway and hollered at me. "Maggie, honey, something smells like heaven in there. Turkey's almost ready," I called back, not turning around. "Come on in if you want." She didn't come in. Nobody ever came into the kitchen. Gary and Linda Marsh. Gary shook Brandon's hand with both of his the way men do when they want to signal something about respect, and Linda kissed Jessica on both cheeks and said the house looked beautiful. It did look beautiful. I had mopped those floors the night before. I had polished the sideboard and ironed the tablecloth and arranged the centerpiece with the dried orange slices and pine cones I'd been collecting since October. Nobody said that part out loud. By 11 o'clock, there were 12 people in my house. Brandon was holding court in the living room, one hand around a bottle of craft beer, telling a story about a deal he'd almost closed that everyone seemed to find fascinating. Jessica floated between the dining room and the living room with a glass of white wine, refilling other people's glasses, touching shoulders, laughing that particular laugh she saved for company. She was a wonderful hostess. She hosted my house beautifully. I was on my third set of dishes. Somewhere around 11:30, Brandon brought the whole group into the dining room to show off the table, and I heard Linda say, "Brandon, this is just gorgeous. You two really outdid yourselves." "We try," Jessica said warmly. I was standing 6 feet away in the kitchen, basting the turkey. It was Ruth who came to the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, and for a moment she just watched me work. I could feel her watching. I kept my eyes on the roasting pan. "Brandon said you've been up since 5. She said quietly. 4:30, I said. She was quiet for a beat. "Does he know that?" I set the baster down and looked up at her. Ruth Dawson had known me for 19 years, had sat at this table for 19 Thanksgivings, and in all that time, she had never once asked me a question like that. The kindness in it was almost too much to take straight on. "It's fine, Ruth," I said. "Go enjoy yourself." She looked at me a moment longer, then nodded slowly and walked back into the dining room. I turned back to the oven. Through the kitchen door, I could hear Brandon start to laugh at something loud and easy and completely at home. The turkey came out perfect. It always did. I carved it in the kitchen the way Frank had taught me, long, clean strokes along the breastbone, and I arranged it on the good platter with the sprigs of rosemary I'd kept back from the stuffing. I carried it out myself because Brandon had offered to help and then gotten pulled into a conversation about football before he made it 3 steps toward the kitchen. I set it on the table without saying anything about it, went back for the gravy, went back again for the green beans, and by the time I sat down or tried to sit down, Gary Marsh had taken the chair nearest the kitchen, and I ended up standing at the sideboard instead, which was fine. I told myself it was fine. I was closer to the gravy boat that way. We were 20 minutes into the meal when it happened. Jessica was telling a story about a charity gala she and Brandon had attended, something about a silent auction and a weekend in Napa. They'd almost won, and the table was laughing and Brandon was leaning back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who has never once carried a serving dish in his life. And then Linda Marsh made the mistake of asking him warmly and with genuine curiosity, "Brandon, how do you two pull off a spread like this every year?" Brandon smiled. It was a good smile. He had always had a good smile. "Honestly." He gestured toward me with his fork the way you'd point out a fixture in a room. "We've got the best secret weapon in the business. Mom handles all of it. She's basically our private chef." He paused and I could feel what was coming, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. "Eleanor got the medical degree. Mom got the apron." He laughed first, then Jessica laughed. Then the table laughed, all 12 of them, warm and easy, and entirely without malice, the way people laugh when a joke is familiar enough to feel like affection. I was standing at the sideboard with the gravy boat in both hands. I smiled. I had been smiling at that joke or versions of that joke for more years than I could count, and I had gotten very good at it. The smile that doesn't reach the eyes but doesn't betray them either. The smile of a woman who has learned that the only thing worse than the joke is reacting to it. Ruth Dawson was not laughing. I caught her eyes across the table and she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between fury and sorrow, and she looked away first because she was kinder than I was and couldn't hold it. I set the gravy boat on the table. I went back into the kitchen. I stood at the sink and I gripped the edge of the counter with both hands and I breathed. Through the door, I could hear the table move on to the next subject, easy and warm, the way water closes over a stone. I don't know how long I stood at that sink. Long enough for the sounds from the dining room to settle into a rhythm I didn't have to listen to anymore. Long enough for the water I'd run to rinse a dish to go cold against my hands. I turned it off and dried my hands on a dish towel and stood there looking at the kitchen. My kitchen, with its yellow walls I'd painted myself the spring after Frank died because I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't crying. Frank had picked that color. He'd held up 2 paint chips at the hardware store on a Saturday morning, squinting at them the way he squinted at everything he took seriously, and said, "Butter yellow. That's the one, Maggie. That's a kitchen color." He'd been right. He was usually right about the things that didn't matter and wrong about the things that did, the way good men sometimes are, and I had loved him for both. He died on a Tuesday in March 7 years ago in the bedroom upstairs with his hand in mine, and the window cracked the way he liked it, even in winter. Brandon had been in the city. I hadn't called him until it was over because Frank had asked me not to, had said he didn't want his last hour to be about Brandon driving too fast on the interstate. That was Frank. Thinking about other people's safety from a hospital bed. 3 days before he died, when he could still talk clearly, he'd made me sit down next to him, and he had looked at me with those steady gray eyes and said it plainly the way he said everything. "Maggie, the house is in your name. Only yours. Arthur has the paperwork. Don't let anybody tell you different, and don't you dare sign anything over to anybody without thinking it through first. That house is yours. You earned every room in it." I had told him not to talk like that. He had told me to listen. I hadn't understood then why he was so specific. Frank had always been specific. It was the engineer in him, the need to account for every variable. I thought he was just being thorough the way he'd always been thorough, the way he'd kept a file folder for every appliance in the house, with the warranty and the purchase receipt clipped together inside. I thought it was just Frank being Frank. Standing in the kitchen 7 years later with the sound of Brandon's laughter rolling in from the dining room, I thought about that conversation for the first time in a long time. I didn't know yet why it was coming back to me now in this moment on this particular afternoon. I only knew that it was, and that it sat in my chest differently than it used to. From the hallway, I heard Ruth's voice, low and deliberate, cutting through the noise. "Maggie." She was at the kitchen door again. "Come here a second, honey." Ruth Dawson was 68 years old and had buried a husband, raised 3 sons, mostly alone, and survived a breast cancer scare that she handled by rearranging her kitchen cabinets and never mentioning it again. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she was not a woman who pulled you aside at a family dinner unless she had something real to say. She took me by the elbow and walked me to the far corner of the kitchen, away from the door, away from the noise. She smelled like the same drugstore perfume she'd worn for as long as I'd known her, and there was something steadying about that, something that made the kitchen feel briefly safer than it had all day. "I need to say something to you," she said, keeping her voice low, "and I need you to actually hear it instead of telling me you're fine." "Ruth, I watched you today." She cut me off not unkindly but firmly, the way a woman cuts off an excuse she's heard too many times. "I watched you carry that turkey out yourself while Brandon sat on his hands. I watched Jessica accept compliments on a table you set and a meal you cooked. And then I watched you stand there with a gravy boat in your hands and smile, while your son made you the punchline of a joke he's clearly been telling for years." Her jaw was tight. "Now you're going to stand here and tell me it's fine." My throat did something complicated. I looked at the counter instead of at her. "He doesn't mean it the way it sounds," I said. "Maggie." Her voice dropped even lower, and she waited until I looked up at her. "A man who doesn't mean it stops saying it. 12 years is not an accident, that's a pattern." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out a folded piece of paper, a page torn from the small notebook she always kept in her purse, and she pressed it into my hand and closed my fingers around it. "That's my number. You have my number. But I want you to have it on paper somewhere you can find it. You call me. Day or night. Whatever you need." I looked down at my closed fist. "I don't know what I need," I said, and it came out quieter than I intended and truer than I'd meant to admit to anyone, including myself. Ruth put both hands over mine, the way older women do when they want you to understand that what they're saying is not a suggestion. "Yes, you do," she said. "You're just not ready to say it yet." From the dining room, Jessica's laugh rose above the rest, bright and effortless, and Ruth released my hands and stepped back and smoothed her cardigan like nothing had happened. "Go on," she said. "I'll cover for you a few more minutes." I tucked the paper into my apron pocket and turned back to the dishes, but my hand stayed closed around nothing long after I'd let it go. The guests left the way. Guests always leave in a rush of coats and leftovers and promises to do this again soon, with hugs for Brandon and Jessica at the door and a wave toward the kitchen in my general direction. Ruth squeezed my hand on her way out, didn't say anything, didn't need to. Gary Marsh shook Brandon's hand again with both of his. Linda told Jessica the pecan pie was extraordinary. Nobody asked who made it. By 3:15, the house was quiet in the way that only happens after a crowd leaves that particular silence that feels louder than the noise did. I stood in the dining room doorway and looked at what 12 people leave behind. Dishes stacked and pushed aside, wine glasses with lipstick on the rims, a chair knocked slightly out of alignment, cranberry sauce dried to a ring on the good tablecloth I had ironed the night before. From the living room, I heard the television come on. Football. The couch cushions shifting under Brandon's weight. Jessica saying something low. Brandon laughing at whatever it was. I picked up the first stack of dishes and carried them to the kitchen. Then I went back for the glasses. Then the serving platters. Then the tablecloth, which I soaked in the sink with cold water and dish soap, because cranberry doesn't come out if you let it sit. And I knew that, and I was the only one in the house who did. I washed dishes for nearly 2 hours. I know the exact time because I watched the clock on the microwave the way you watch a clock when you're doing something that needs to end. The turkey carcass went into the stock pot because Frank had always said you never waste a carcass, and I had kept that habit the way I had kept so many of his habits, wearing them like clothing that still fit, even after the person who gave them to you was gone. At 4:50, I wiped down the stovetop. At 5, I swept the kitchen floor. At 5:10, I hung the dish towels over the oven handle to dry and stood in the center of the kitchen and looked at what I had done. It was spotless. It looked like nobody had cooked in it at all. From the living room, Brandon called out without looking away from the screen. "Hey, Mom, is there any pie left?" I stood very still for a moment. Then I cut him a slice, put it on a plate, and carried it to him. He took it without looking up. "Thanks," he said. I went back to the kitchen. I thought about the paper in my apron pocket. Then I thought about the bedroom upstairs and the fact that I still needed to ask Brandon if he wanted any more dessert before I put everything away. I dried my hands. I started up the stairs. Before I tell you what I heard on the other side of that door, the thing that changed everything, drop a 7 in the comments right now, so I know you're still with me. Because what comes next, I never saw coming. And I don't think you will either. A quick note. The story ahead contains some fictional elements woven in to make the message land the way it needs to. If that's not something you want, this is a good place to step away, no judgment at all. But if you're staying, hold on tight. The bedroom door was not fully closed. That was the thing I would come back to later in the weeks that followed, when I replayed it the way you replay something you wish you could unhear. If the door had been closed all the way, I would have knocked. I would have asked about the pie. I would have gone back downstairs and put the leftovers away and gone to bed and woken up the next morning and done what I always did, which was tell myself everything was fine. But the door was open 3 inches and I heard my name. I stopped on the landing. My hand was on the wall. The hallway light was off, and I was standing in the dark, and I could see the strip of lamplight under the door, and I could hear them clearly the way you can hear everything in an old house if you know where to stand. Jessica was talking. She had the focused, efficient voice she used when she was solving a problem, the same voice she used on the phone with contractors and insurance companies. The voice that meant she had already made up her mind and was now managing the details. After the holidays makes the most sense, she was saying. We start looking in January. There are places that aren't that expensive if you don't need a private room. She's not going to like it, Brandon said. She doesn't have to like it, she just has to go. A pause. Brandon, think about it. She's here all day, every day, doing nothing. We're basically running a free hotel for someone who contributes nothing to this household. She cooks, Brandon said. And I will never know if he meant it as a defense or just a fact. She cooks, Jessica repeated, and the way she said it made it sound like the smallest thing in the world. Your aunt has a PhD and a faculty position at Northwestern. Your mother has a crock pot and a lot of free time. At some point, that's not our problem to manage, Brandon. There are facilities for this, affordable ones. The word, affordable, landed in my chest like something dropped from a height. What do I tell her? Brandon asked. Nothing yet. Let me find some options first. We'll present it like it's a good thing, like we're doing her a favor. Jessica's voice shifted lighter now, the problem nearly solved in her mind. She'll be fine. Women like your mother are always fine. They're built for it. Women like your mother. I stood in the dark hallway with my hand flat against the wall, and I felt something happen inside my chest that I did not have a name for yet. It wasn't anger, though. Anger was in it. It wasn't grief, though grief was there too. It was something colder and quieter and more final than either of those things. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I stood there and I listened until I had heard enough, and then I turned around and walked back down the stairs in the dark one, careful step at a time. I sat down at the kitchen table. I want to be clear about that because it was not something I did. Not in this house, not in the middle of a day when there were still dishes in the drying rack and leftover containers to label and a stock pot on the stove that needed to come down to a simmer. I did not sit down in the middle of things. I had not sat down in the middle of things in longer than I could remember. But I sat down, and I put my hands flat on the table and I looked at them. These hands had packed Brandon's lunch every school day for 13 years, had held him through chicken pox and a broken collarbone, and the night his first girlfriend told him she didn't want to see him anymore, and he cried in a way that broke something in me because he was 17 and heartbroken and still small enough in that moment to need his mother. These hands had signed the mortgage papers when Frank got sick, and the bills started coming faster than the paychecks. Had written the check for Brandon's first semester at DePaul because Frank's life insurance covered the house, but not the tuition. And I had gone back to work at 41 waitressing at a diner on Route 30 for 14 months until I found the bookkeeping job that paid better and asked less of my feet. I had never told Brandon about the diner. It had not seemed important at the time. I had not wanted him to feel guilty or obligated or like his education had cost something it shouldn't have. I had wanted him to feel like it was easy because I loved him. And that was what I knew how to do. Make hard things look easy so the people I loved wouldn't have to carry the weight of them. I understood now, sitting at that table, that I had done him no favors. I thought about the job in Chicago, the office manager position I'd been offered the year Brandon turned 3 with a salary that would have changed everything, and I had turned it down because Frank was traveling for work and Brandon was too young for full-time daycare, and someone had to be home. Someone always had to be home. I had told myself I would find something else later. Later had a way of becoming never, and never had a way of becoming a life. Frank had found me crying in this kitchen once over nothing, over everything, and he had sat down across from me and said, "Maggie, what do you want? Not for us, for you." And I had looked at him and realized I didn't know how to answer that question anymore. That was the year Brandon turned 8. I was 31 years old. I was 55 now, and the question had not gotten easier. Upstairs, I heard footsteps cross the floor above my head. Brandon moving toward the bathroom. The ordinary sounds of a man in a house that was about to stop being his. I reached for my phone and called my sister. Eleanor picked up on the second ring the way she always did, because Eleanor had never once in her life let a call from me go to voicemail. Maggie. Her voice was warm and a little tired, the way it got on days she'd been teaching. "Happy Thanksgiving. How did it go?" I opened my mouth to say what I always said. "Fine, good. Busy, but good. You know how it is." What came out instead was nothing. Just silence and then a sound. I didn't plan something that started in my chest and came up through my throat before I could stop it. Not quite a sob, not quite a word, just the sound of 11 years of finally running out of room. "Maggie." Eleanor's voice changed completely. The tiredness was gone. "Talk to me, right now. What happened?" So I told her. All of it in a low voice at the kitchen table, with one ear toward the ceiling in case I heard footsteps on the stairs. The morning, the joke, the gravy boat, the nearly 2 hours of dishes while Brandon watched football, the door that was open 3 inches, and everything I had heard through it. My voice stayed level because I had learned a long time ago that if you let your voice break, people spend their energy on your feelings instead of your facts, and I needed Eleanor to hear the facts. When I finished, she was quiet for 4 full seconds. I counted. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Maggie, listen to me very carefully. Do not say a word to Brandon or Jessica tonight. Not one word. Do you understand me?" "I understand." "I'm calling Arthur." Arthur Caldwell had been Frank's attorney for 20 years and had handled the estate after Frank died. Eleanor had his number because Eleanor had the number of everyone who mattered. "I want to know exactly where things stand before you do anything. I'll call you back tonight." "Eleanor, it's Thanksgiving." "Arthur doesn't care," she said flatly. "He'll pick up for me. He always picks up for me." A pause, and then her voice softened just slightly the way it did when she stopped being efficient and started being my sister. "You've been carrying this alone for a long time, Maggie. You don't have to anymore." "Okay." I pressed my hand flat against the table to keep it steady. "Okay," I said. We hung up. The kitchen was very quiet. I stood up and I reached behind my back and I untied the apron strings. I lifted the loop over my head and I held it for a moment, the faded blue stripes, the pocket with Ruth's number still folded inside, and then I opened the drawer next to the stove and I laid it in and I closed the drawer. Not on the hook by the door where it had lived for 11 years. In the drawer. Out of sight. Finished. I sat back down and I waited for Eleanor to call. Before I reveal what Arthur Caldwell told me that morning, the one thing Brandon never thought to check, the one thing Frank made sure of before he left this world, comment, "Deed below, so I know you're here with me." Because what I'm about to tell you is the moment this whole story turns. And Brandon never saw it coming. One more thing before we go further. Some details in what follows have been shaped for storytelling purposes and may not reflect every real-life situation exactly. If you'd rather not continue, you're welcome to step away, truly no hard feelings. But if you're ready, let's finish this together. Eleanor called back at 9:47 that night. I was sitting in the kitchen with the lights low and a cup of tea I hadn't touched, listening to the sounds of the house settle around me, the television still going upstairs, the occasional creak of the floor above my head, the refrigerator humming the same note it had hummed for 11 years. I picked up before the second ring. I talked to Arthur. Eleanor said no preamble, no small talk. He pulled up the file tonight. Maggie, I need you to listen to me and I need you to stay calm. I'm calm, I said. The house is yours. Completely and entirely yours. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded almost like anger on my behalf, carefully contained. Frank put the deed in your name alone when you bought it. When he died, it transferred to you outright under the terms of his will. There was no joint tenancy, no co-ownership, nothing. The property is titled solely to Margaret Ann Miller. Brandon's name is not on any document connected to this house. Not the deed, not the mortgage which you paid off 4 years ago. By the way, Arthur confirmed that too, not anything. I set my tea down very carefully. He never asked, I said. It wasn't a question. He never asked. Eleanor confirmed. Arthur said in 20 years of practice, he has seen this exact situation more times than he can count. Adult children who live in a parent's home and simply assume. They never check because they never think they need to. I thought about Brandon at 9 years old, the way he used to come home from school and drop his backpack in the middle of the kitchen floor without breaking stride, absolutely certain that someone would move it, that the house would absorb it, that the world would arrange itself around him the way it always had. Some things do not change as much as we hope they will. What are my options? I asked. Under Illinois law, Eleanor said, and I could hear her reading from notes Arthur had clearly sent her. As the sole owner of the property, you have the right to ask any occupant without a lease agreement to vacate. A written 30-day notice is the standard legal requirement. Arthur can prepare the paperwork tonight and bring it to you in the morning. 30 days. Maggie. Eleanor's voice came back softer now, just my sister. You don't have to do this, but you can. That's what Frank made sure of. You can. Upstairs, the television clicked off. The house went quiet. Tell Arthur to come at 10, I said. Arthur Caldwell arrived at 10 o'clock exactly the way he always did, because Arthur had been punctual for 63 years and saw no reason to change now. He was a tall man who had gone thin in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of unhurried manner that made you feel, even in a crisis, that things were being handled. He carried a slim leather briefcase and wore a jacket and tie on the Friday after Thanksgiving because Arthur Caldwell dressed for the work, not for the calendar. I let him in through the front door. Brandon was still upstairs. I had heard him in the shower 20 minutes earlier, heard Jessica's voice through the ceiling, the ordinary morning sounds of people who had no idea the floor was about to change under them. Arthur and I sat at the kitchen table. He opened his briefcase and laid 2 documents flat on the table between us, turning them so I could read them right side up. This is the notice to vacate, he said, setting one finger on the first document. Under Illinois law, as the property owner, you are required to provide occupants who have no written lease agreement a minimum of 30 days written notice to vacate the premises. I've dated it today. That gives them until December 29th. He moved his finger to the second document. This is a summary of the property title confirming sole ownership. If they dispute the notice, this is what ends the conversation. Will they dispute it? I asked. They can try, Arthur said with the calm of a man who has watched people try things for 40 years. But there's nothing to dispute. The deed is unambiguous. Frank was very thorough. He paused. He came to me 3 months before he passed and asked me to make absolutely certain the title was clean. He said, Arthur stopped, then continued carefully. He said he wanted to make sure you always had somewhere to stand. I looked down at the documents. He wanted to make sure you always had somewhere to stand. I picked up the pen Arthur set beside the papers and I signed my name at the bottom of the notice. Margaret Ann Miller, the same signature I had put on every important piece of paper in this house for 30 years. We heard Brandon on the stairs. Arthur did not move, did not shift, did not straighten his jacket. He simply waited with his hands folded on the table, the way a man waits when he knows he has time and the other person does not. Brandon pushed open the kitchen door in a t-shirt and jeans, already reaching for the coffee maker, and stopped when he saw Arthur. Mom, who is... Sit down, Brandon, I said. Something in my voice made him sit. Arthur slid the notice across the table without a word. Brandon read it twice. I watched his face go through things I had never seen on it before. Confusion first, the genuine kind, the kind that comes before understanding and is almost innocent in its blankness. Then something shifted behind his eyes as the words landed in the right order, and he understood what he was holding, and the confusion became something uglier and louder. "What is this?" His voice cracked on the last word. "Mom, what is this?" "It's a notice to vacate," Arthur said before I could answer. "It's a legal document requiring you and your wife to vacate this property within 30 days. December 29th is your deadline. This is our house." Brandon's hand came down flat on the table. Not quite a slam, but close the gesture of a man reaching for authority he had never actually had. "I grew up in this house. You can't just—" "Brandon." My voice was quiet. It stopped him the way quiet sometimes stops people faster than loud. "Whose name is on the deed?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "I don't know," he said, and the admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised me that he'd never thought to find out. "I just assumed—" "I know what you assumed," I said. Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe, hair undone, reading the room in 3 seconds the way she always did. Her eyes went from Brandon to Arthur to the documents on the table, and her face did something fast and calculating before it settled into outrage. "What is going on?" She crossed to Brandon, picked up the notice, read the first paragraph. "Are you serious right now?" She looked at me with an expression I had seen her use on contractors who'd missed a deadline. "Maggie, this is insane. You cannot do this. We live here. We have rights." "You have 30 days, I said. We have rights." She said again, louder, as if volume would change the law. Arthur folded his hands on the table. "As occupants without a lease agreement, your rights in this situation are limited to the 30-day notice period you've been given, which is actually more than the minimum Illinois law requires. I'd recommend using the time wisely." Jessica turned on him with the full force of her outrage, and Arthur looked back at her with the patience of a man who has outlasted a great many people who were certain they were right. Brandon wasn't looking at either of them. He was looking at me, and his face had moved past anger into something younger and rawer that I recognized from a long time ago. From a boy with a broken collarbone, and a boy with a broken heart, and every in-between thing I had held together with my own 2 hands. "Mom," he said, "where are we supposed to go?" I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about the nursing home brochure Jessica was going to start collecting in January. I thought about affordable ones. I thought about lazy, cheap labor. "You have 30 days, Brandon," I said. "That's more than you gave me." I stood up, picked up my coffee, and walked out of the kitchen. They were out by December 22nd, 7 days early, which surprised me and then didn't because Jessica was nothing if not efficient, and even in a situation she hadn't chosen, she would find a way to manage the timeline. I watched from the upstairs window as the moving truck backed into the driveway, watched 2 men carry out the sectional sofa. I had helped Brandon pick out 3 years ago at the furniture store on Route 59. Watched Jessica direct them with the clipboard she had apparently made for the occasion because Jessica made a clipboard for every occasion. I did not go downstairs while they were there. There was nothing left to say, and I had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you can do in a room is not be in it. By 4 in the afternoon, they were gone. I walked through the house slowly, room by room, the way you walk through something you are memorizing or something you are releasing, and I couldn't tell yet which one it was. Brandon's old room, which had been their guest room, which had been a storage room before that, which had been a little boy's room before everything. The bathroom with the cracked tile I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. The hallway where the wall still held a faint mark from the time Brandon had thrown a baseball inside the house at age 9, and Frank had made him repaint the entire wall himself as the consequence. I stood in front of that mark for a long time. In the city, I later learned from Eleanor, the first week went badly in the specific way that things go badly when you have never once had to hold them up yourself. Brandon burned a pot of pasta on a Tuesday because he had never learned to watch a stove, something I had simply always done for him without either of us noticing. Jessica called a plumber for a slow drain that turned out to need a $5 tool from the hardware store and an 8-minute YouTube tutorial. Their first electric bill, which I had always rolled into the household account, I managed arrived and was twice what either of them had expected. Brandon called Eleanor on a Wednesday night, frustrated and tired, and looking Eleanor told me later for someone to tell him it wasn't his fault. Eleanor had told him gently but without softening it that it was. "He asked about you," Eleanor said when she called me. "I told him you were fine." I was standing in the kitchen when she set it at the counter where the apron hook had been for 11 years. I had taken it down sometime in the first week after they left, pulled it off the wall, filled the hole with spackle, painted over it on a quiet afternoon when I needed something to do with my hands. You couldn't tell it had ever been there. "I am fine," I said. And for the first time in a long time, I meant it in the direction of the truth. Patty Warren had lived next door for 14 years and had never once rung my doorbell before noon. She rang it at 9:15 on a Thursday morning, 3 days after Brandon and Jessica moved out, holding a casserole dish covered in foil and wearing the expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time for permission to say something. I let her in. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Arthur had laid out his documents 2 weeks earlier, and Patty set the casserole between us like an offering and looked at me the way people look at you when they already know more than you've told them. "Ruth Dawson called me," she said, not apologetic, just honest. "Of course she did," I said. "She was worried about you." Patty wrapped both hands around her mug. She was 48, sturdy, and direct, a woman who had raised 2 kids alone after her divorce and had strong opinions about casserole and stronger ones about everything else. "I've been worried about you for longer than Ruth has, for the record. I've watched that boy treat this house like a hotel for 3 years, and I never said anything because you never asked me to, and I respected that. But Maggie..." She leaned forward. "I watched the moving truck leave, and I watched your lights stay off until 10 o'clock that night, and I am not going to sit over there and pretend I'm not concerned." I looked at my coffee. "I'm okay, Patty." "I know you're okay," she said. "You're always okay. That's actually what concerns me." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, the same gesture Ruth had made at Thanksgiving, and I thought about how many times in my life the women around me had tried to hand me something I kept not taking. What are you going to do now? And I mean really, not okay, not fine. What do you actually want? There it was again. Frank's question, Ruth's question, and now Patty's. The same question finding me from every direction like it was tired of waiting. I sat with it for a moment. Outside, a cardinal landed on the bare branch of the oak tree in the backyard, the same tree Frank had strung lights in. Every December, the same tree Brandon had climbed at 7 and gotten stuck in and cried until Frank talked him down, rung by rung. "I want to cook," I said slowly. "Not for people who don't notice, for people who need it." I paused, surprised by how certain it felt coming out. "I want to open something, somewhere small, somewhere people actually come in, hungry and leave feeling like somebody saw them." Patty stared at me for a second. Then she sat back and smiled the wide, real kind. "There she is," she said. "I was wondering when you'd show up." I looked at her and felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight for so long I had forgotten it was there. Outside, the cardinal was still on the branch. It stayed there a long time. Eleanor flew in from Boston on a Tuesday in January, the kind of gray, bone-cold Tuesday that Naperville does better than anywhere else in the world. And she showed up at my door with a carry-on bag and a look on her face that said she was staying until this was done. We had coffee first, the way we always did, because Eleanor believed that no significant thing should be done without coffee. And I believed she was right. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing that mattered and everything that did the way sisters talk when they haven't been fully honest with each other in a long time and are making up for it. "You should have called me sooner," she said, not accusing, just stating. "I know," I said. "I would have come." "I know that too," I said. "That was part of why I didn't." She looked at me for a moment, then nodded slowly because Eleanor was smart enough to understand what I meant without my having to explain it. that asking for help had felt for a very long time like admitting the whole thing had been a mistake, that if I called Eleanor, I would have to say out loud that I was not fine, and if I said that out loud, I would have to decide what to do about it, and deciding meant changing, and changing meant loss, even when what you were losing was something that had already been hurting you for years. The real estate agent came at 11. She was a brisk, competent woman named Donna, who had sold 4 houses on our street and knew the market the way Arthur knew property law completely and without drama. She walked through the house with a clipboard, made notes, told us what she thought it would list for, and we signed the listing agreement at the kitchen table before noon. Afterward, Donna left, and Eleanor and I stood in the front hallway together, looking at the house the way you look at something you are finished with but not done grieving. "Frank picked the butter yellow," I said. "I know," Eleanor said. "He called me the day you painted it. He was so proud of himself for getting the color right." I laughed. It came out sudden and real and surprised me. Then Eleanor took my hand and held it. And I thought about Frank 3 months before he died, sitting across from Arthur Caldwell, making sure the title was clean, making sure I always had somewhere to stand. He had known maybe better than I had that the day might come when I would need a door I could open by myself. He had spent his last good months making sure I had the key. I squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Okay," I said. "Let's go." We walked out together and I pulled the door shut behind us and I did not look back. Montrose, Colorado sits in a wide valley between the San Juan Mountains and the Uncompahgre Plateau. And in April, the mornings are cold and bright in a way that feels like a promise the day intends to keep. I had driven through it once years ago on a road trip with Frank, and he had said, "Maggie, if I ever retire, I want to retire somewhere the sky looks like that." He never got the chance. I figured I could go for both of us. I found the space in February, a former hardware store on Oak Avenue, with wide plank floors and good bones, and windows that caught the morning light the way the kitchen in Naperville never quite had. The owner, a retired rancher named Dale, had been trying to sell it for 2 years and accepted my offer the same afternoon I made it. I think he could tell I was serious. People who have been waiting a long time to do something tend to look serious when they finally do it. I spent 6 weeks cleaning, painting, buying equipment, learning more than I ever wanted to know about commercial kitchen ventilation and health department permits. I was 55 years old, and my knees reminded me of that fact every morning I spent on the floor scrubbing baseboards, but I had been getting up at 4 in the morning for 11 years, and my hands still knew how to work. They had never forgotten. Eleanor called every Sunday. Patty sent a card with a cardinal on the front. I hung it above the pass-through window between the kitchen and the counter, where I could see it while I cooked. I named it Miller's Kitchen, Frank's name. My kitchen, both things true at once. I opened on a Thursday in April, which is not the day anyone would recommend for opening a restaurant, but I had done enough things on other people's schedules. I unlocked the front door at 6:30 in the morning and turned the sign from closed to open and stood behind the counter and waited. Walt Henderson was sitting on the bench outside. I hadn't noticed him when I unlocked the door. He was a quiet man, the kind that doesn't announce himself, and he'd been sitting there long enough that he'd become part of the scenery. He was 72 years old with a weathered face and the careful way of moving that belongs to men who have carried heavy things for a long time and learned to be deliberate about it. He wore a canvas jacket and a feed store cap, and he stood up slowly when he heard the lock turn. "Morning," he said. "You the one who's been fixing this place up?" "I am," I said. "Been watching the progress." He nodded toward the window. "Looked like you knew what you were doing." "Most days," I said. "Come on in." He sat at the counter, the stool closest to the kitchen window, and I handed him a menu I had typed and printed myself on cardstock the color of cream. It wasn't a long menu. Eggs, toast, oatmeal, soup, pie. Things that were hot and made from scratch and cost what a working person could actually pay. That had been the whole idea from the beginning, and sitting in my new kitchen on Oak Avenue, I was more certain of it than ever. Walt ordered the vegetable soup and a piece of cornbread and a cup of coffee black. I made all of it fresh, the soup from a stock I'd started at 4 that morning because good soup starts with time, and I had been getting up at 4 for so long it didn't feel like a sacrifice anymore. It felt like what I did. I set the bowl in front of him and the cornbread beside it still warm from the oven, and I refilled his coffee without being asked. because some reflexes you keep and some you let go, and knowing the difference is the whole work of a life. He ate slowly the way people eat when they're actually tasting something. When he finished, he set his spoon down and looked at the empty bowl for a moment, the way you look at something that gave you more than you expected. "My wife used to make soup like that," he said. "She passed 4 years ago." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it without ceremony. "Best meal I've had since," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and set 2 bills on the counter, enough to cover the meal twice over. When I started to make change, he shook his head. "Keep it. You earned it." He stood, put his cap back on, and buttoned his jacket. At the door, he stopped and turned back. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maggie," I said. "Maggie Miller." He nodded once, slow and certain the way people nod when a name fits the person saying it. "I'll be back tomorrow, Maggie Miller," he said. The door opened and the cold April air came in clean and bright and smelling of pine and distance, and Walt Henderson walked out into it, and I watched him go. And then I turned back to my kitchen, nobody else's, and I started on the next pot of soup. By noon, every stool at my counter was full. I want to tell you what was happening in the city while I was learning the name of every regular who walked through my door on Oak Avenue, because I think it matters not for the satisfaction of it. I have tried very hard not to build my piece on the wreckage of someone else's, but because it is part of the true shape of the story, and the true shape is the only one worth telling. Eleanor told me in pieces the way you tell someone something difficult when you're not sure how much they want to hear. She called on Sunday nights the way she always did, and sometimes she said nothing about Brandon at all, and sometimes she said a little, and I let her read me the way she always had and give me what she thought I could hold. Brandon and Jessica had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Lakeview, which was more than they could comfortably afford on Brandon's salary alone, because Jessica had been accustomed to a certain kind of life and found it difficult to adjust the picture she had of herself downward. The rent was $2,300 a month. The utilities, which I had always folded into the household account I managed, turned out to be another $400. The groceries, which I had always bought, planned, and cooked, were a category neither of them had ever actually budgeted for, and it showed. Brandon had never learned to cook beyond the basics because I had never made it necessary. And I had never made it necessary because I had loved him and wanted things to be easy for him, and I could see now clearly and without flinching that the kindness had been its own kind of harm. He was 32 years old and he was learning to boil water like a college freshman, and that was something I had done to him as much as he had done to himself. Jessica had taken a harder line. She had gone back to work full-time at the marketing firm where she'd gone part-time after the wedding, and she was good at her job. Eleanor said genuinely good, which did not entirely surprise me. Jessica was competent. She had always been competent. She had simply, in my house, directed that competence entirely toward managing what I provided, rather than building anything of her own. And now that the infrastructure was gone, she was discovering that she was capable of more than she had bothered to try. Whether that made her better or just different, I couldn't say. I had stopped trying to reach verdicts on people. Brandon called Eleanor in March and then again in April, and each time Eleanor told me about it, she was careful to be factual and not editorial, which was its own kind of information. The March call was angry. Brandon had wanted Eleanor to agree that what I had done was extreme, that a mother doesn't do that to a son, that there had to be something wrong with me, some bitterness or breakdown that explained it. Because the alternative that I had simply clearly and with full possession of my faculties decided I was done was something he couldn't hold yet. Eleanor had not agreed. She had listened for 20 minutes and then said, "Brandon, I love you, and I need you to sit with this instead of explaining it away. Your mother didn't break. She just finally stopped pretending she wasn't broken." The April call was quieter. He didn't have an agenda this time, Eleanor told me. He just asked how you were. I told him you had opened a restaurant and that it was doing well. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "She always could cook," like he was saying it to himself, like he was just now understanding what that meant. I was at the counter at Miller's Kitchen when Eleanor told me that wiping down the surface, between the lunch rush and the dinner prep, the same motion I had made 10,000 times in my life, but different now in the way that all the same things are different when you're doing them for yourself. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said yes," Eleanor said. "She always could." I set the cloth down. Outside the window on Oak Avenue, the late afternoon light was coming in at the angle it comes in April in the mountains, long and golden and unhurried, and it fell across the counter and the pie case and the two stools where Walt Henderson and his neighbor's grandson had sat that morning, arguing pleasantly about fly fishing, and it lit up the room the way good light does not, by erasing the shadows, but by making them the right size. "He asked if he could call you," Eleanor said carefully. "I told him that was your decision, not mine." I thought about it for a moment. The boy with the broken collarbone. The boy who cried at 17 over his first heartbreak. The 32-year-old man who had sat at my kitchen table and not looked up from his phone when I told him the turkey had been in since 5. "Not yet," I said. "Maybe someday, but not yet." Eleanor didn't push. That was the thing about Eleanor. She never pushed. "Okay," she said. "How's the pie today?" "Good," I said. "Well, come try it sometime." "I'm booking a flight," she said. And I could hear her smiling, and I smiled back at the empty room, at the good light at the pie case with 2 slices left at the life I was building, 1 soup pot and 1 honest conversation at a time. The last customer left at 8:17. I know the exact time because I had started keeping a small notebook by the register, not for the numbers, though I kept those too, but for the things I wanted to remember. The woman who came in on a Wednesday and told me the chicken soup tasted like her grandmother's, and then sat there for a moment with her eyes bright and her hands wrapped around the bowl like it was something she needed to hold. The high school boy who counted out exact change every afternoon for a grilled cheese and never once looked embarrassed about it because I had priced it so he wouldn't have to be. Walt Henderson, who had been in every single morning since opening day and always sat on the same stool and always ordered the same thing and always left the same generous tip, and had over the course of 6 weeks told me more about his life than most people tell a friend in a year. At 8:17, the door closed behind my last table of the evening 2 highway workers who had driven 40 minutes out of their way, because one of them had eaten here the week before and told his buddy about it, and I turned the sign from open to closed and stood in the quiet of my own restaurant and breathed. I had a routine for closing. I had always had routines, had always found comfort in the shape of them, the way a reliable sequence of tasks makes a day feel like something you built instead of something that happened to you. I wiped down the counter. I covered the pie case. I put the last of the soup into containers and labeled them for tomorrow, because good stock doesn't go to waste and neither does a good day. And then I did something I had been saving. I went to the kitchen and I ladled out a bowl of the white bean and ham soup I had made that morning, the recipe that had been in my head for 20 years, and that I had never once made for myself because there was always someone else's order ahead of it. I cut a thick slice of the cornbread. I poured a glass of sweet tea. I carried it all out to the counter, and I sat down on the stool closest to the window Walt's stool, though he wasn't here to object, and I put my napkin in my lap and I ate. Outside on Oak Avenue, Montrose was doing what small towns do at 8 in the evening in April, settling and lights coming on in windows, a truck moving slow down the street with nowhere urgent to be. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but I knew they were there the way, certain things are there even when you can't see them, because you've felt their weight and their shelter, and you've learned to trust that they don't move. The soup was good. I want to say that plainly because I spent a long time cooking things and not tasting them moving too fast between one task and the next to stop and register whether what I'd made was any good. It was good. The beans were soft and the broth was deep, and the ham had given everything it had to the pot, the way the best ingredients do, quietly and completely, and without asking for anything back. I thought about Frank. I thought about the butter yellow kitchen in the hardware store on a Saturday morning and the way he used to come home to a meal I'd made and eat it slowly and then say, "Maggie, this is the best thing I've ever eaten," and mean it every single time, and how I had laughed at him every single time, and how I understood now that he hadn't been exaggerating. He had been paying attention. He had always been paying attention. I just hadn't known yet that being seen was something I was allowed to need. I thought about the apron in the drawer in Naperville. The hook I had spackled over and painted. The folding table dragged in from the garage for 14 people who never once asked who dragged it. I thought about Ruth's number on a piece of folded paper, about Patty's casserole, about Eleanor on a cold Tuesday in January standing in the hallway of a house that had already been released holding my hand. I thought about the question, Frank's question, Ruth's question, Patty's question. What do you want Maggie not for everyone else? For you. I was eating the answer. The door opened. I looked up, surprised I had turned the sign, and Walt Henderson stood in the doorway in his canvas jacket and his feed store cap, holding something wrapped in a dish towel. "Left my glasses," he said. Then he saw me at the counter with my bowl, and he stopped. He looked at me for a moment with the particular understanding of a person who has also, at some point in their life, had to learn how to sit down. "Good," he said. "Just that." He found his glasses on the counter by the register, picked them up, and tucked them in his pocket. At the door, he paused. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "Same time tomorrow," I said. He nodded and pulled the door shut behind him, and I heard his truck start on the street outside, and then the street was quiet again, and I was alone in my restaurant with my soup and my cornbread, and the mountains in the dark, and the small, durable, unspectacular fact of my own life, which was mine, which had always been mine, which I was only now finally sitting down to eat. Here is the only thing I know for certain after all of it. The people who hold everything up are not invisible because nobody sees them. They are invisible because they have agreed year by year and task by task and smile by smile to be. The agreement is quiet. It is made out of love, or what love gets bent into when nobody asks you what you actually need. And the only way out of it is not a scene, not a confrontation, not a single dramatic moment. It is a decision made in the dark on a landing outside a half-open door to stop agreeing. I finished my soup. I washed my bowl. I turned off the lights in Miller's kitchen one by one, and I walked out into the April night, and the air was cold and clean and smelled of pine and distance and possibility. And I stood on the sidewalk on Oak Avenue in Montrose, Colorado, and I looked up, and the sky was full of stars in a way that a sky in Naperville never quite manages. And I thought, Frank, you were right about this place. If there is someone in your life who holds everything up and never once sits down at the table, tell them tonight that you see them, not what they do, them. And if that person is you, if you are reading this and you recognized yourself somewhere in this story, then I want you to hear this from someone who knows you are allowed to put down the tray. You are allowed to sit down. The table will not fall. And if it does, it was never yours to hold up alone. Thank you for being here. Leave a comment and tell me about the meal you've been saving for yourself. And share this with the person you thought of while I was talking. You already know who it is. Here is what I know now that I wish I had known at 31. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see when I was standing at that sink with flour on my hands and a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I thought carrying everything was the same as being loved. It isn't. And the years I spent believing that I can't get them back, but I can choose differently now. And so can you. Don't be me. Don't wait until you overhear your own name spoken like a task on someone else's to-do list. Don't wait for a lawyer and a moving truck to remind you that your life belongs to you. I believe God did not put any of us on this earth to be useful furniture in someone else's house. We are not here to hold up tables we are never invited to sit at. My opinion earned the hard way the moment you decide your time and your heart belong to you first. That is not selfishness. That is survival. The best revenge stories with Mom don't end with a fight. They end with a woman who finally sat down and ate her own meal. This is the family drama nobody talks about, the quiet kind, the kind that walks out and builds something real. If this story found you tonight, share it with someone who needs it. Comment and tell me where you are in your own story. And if you want more family drama and revenge stories with Mom that remind you who you really are, subscribe. There's always a seat here for you. Thank you for staying until the very end. Truly. A gentle note, some stories on this channel include fictional elements built for reflection and meaning. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. But if you're still here, I'll see you in the next one.